Hi, I'm John Galloway.
And I'm Jeff Fritz.
So we're going to be talking in this session about middleware, custom middleware, digging into some middleware internals.
Yeah, middleware feels like a buzzword.
It does. You know, but once I started digging into ASP.NET Core more and more, I realized everything's middleware, and that's where all the real power is. You know, everything you configure, authentication, MVC, all the, routing, that's where everything's wired up. And the cool thing with that is you can plug in, middleware is great for a lot of reasons, but one is you can plug into this stack, right? And so you can say, add my middleware after this one, before this one. I can completely control it. I can debug it.
Yep.
And I can write my own.
Absolutely. Let's take a look at writing some of our own.
All right.
So here on my machine, I have an empty ASP.NET Core application that just has some of the basics configured at this point. Okay, there's nothing going on in my startup class. I have a configure method here, and I'm accessing the logger factory just so that I can create a logger so I can start to interact with my log as I'm building my application. The one other thing that I've done is I've gone into my project, and just like I did when we worked on our video about authorization, I've activated the .NET Watcher inside of my application by adding this line, .NET CLI tool reference, Microsoft .NET Watcher tools, version 2.0. And this will let me rerun my application every time there's a C# change inside my code that I save. Okay, so if I run this application right now, I'll say .NET Watch run. So this will run my application and start watching it to make sure that it restarts if there are any changes. And there it is, it's running and it's listening on this location. So I will copy that and I'll come over here to my browser, navigate to that location, and I just get hello world.
Okay.
Now I get hello world because in this configure method, where I configure my middleware, the last thing that happens is this app run, and whatever the context is, we're going to change the content type to HTML, and we're going to output hello world.
So this is actually pretty crazy. You've got in just a few lines of code, you're serving web requests.
I'm serving web requests with HTML, but what I want to point out here is this run statement is a terminating piece of middleware. Okay? We don't actually pass on to another item after this occurs. Okay, this is the end of the chain, nothing more happens, and this is typically what we'll see when we see that use MVC inside of our middleware, right? That's a terminating piece, even though it's using the phrase use MVC, you could continue on and have something after it, but by convention, run says there's nothing that occurs after this. This is the end of it, okay? So this is terminating. Now, other ones that we have out there are things like app.useStaticFiles, right? So this will pass on control if there are things that it doesn't know how to respond to. So if somebody's made a request for what it finds as a static file on disk, it'll serve that static file and stop processing. And it's important that I put that in before the run statement because I want to make sure that we don't always get a hello world when I serve my request. Now I have an index.html that I wrote to disk that just says hello from index.html. If I browse to /index.html, I get hello from index.html. If I don't go to that page, if I go somewhere else, I still get hello world.
So that order, like you're saying, really matters because if that serves use static files was after the use MVC,
let's try.
Yeah.
I'm going to move it down using Alt down and put it after my run statement. So now let me go back to the browser, and it says hello world, even though I've requested index.html. That's because it knows to serve index.html after it specifies that terminating endpoint where it's saying hello world.
So that gives me a lot of power and flexibility to say this is exactly the order of how I want my middleware process.
Absolutely. All right, so now let's go back over here, and that's, there it is. Oops. I'll do app.useStaticFiles. There we go. Now, I can start to write my own use statements here to do other things that are important with my, my pipeline, my request pipeline. So let's do something here where we'll actually output the environment information to our log. So I will write app.use, and I can put an anonymous statement in here so that it actually goes through and executes this on every request.
Okay.
So the format we need to use is async, some context, and then a next pointer to what's going to be the next feature that we request. All right, and now I can interact with the pipeline directly as it's being walked through. So I will say logger.log information, and I can say beginning request in this environment name.
Okay.
All right, and that'll log that information out for me when there's a request. So my compile is finished. I'll request this page, and it actually didn't return anything, but I'm getting my beginning request statement written out. Why didn't it return anything? Because my use statement here is being passed in information about the HTTP context and a pointer to the next item that's being executed. So you actually need to tell it, go do the next thing.
Okay.
So let's do that. So now I can say await next, and it'll execute the next item in the pipeline. So I'll save that. I'll make sure that it finishes restarting here. Let me come back to my browser, and now when I request this, I get hello from index.html, because that's the next piece in the pipeline. And if I look over here in my log, I get beginning request in development, and then I see it served the static file.
Great. Okay.
So we've inserted some information, and we're processing that static file. Now let me go one step further. That next statement is being executed, and I could still execute other things after those other things finish.
So that gives me the flexibility to say, call this, complete executing the middleware, but I want the final say after that.
Absolutely. So what if I set up a timer here, and when I'm done, I can say logger, log information. There it is. And I can say...
And as you're typing that, you're using the string interpolation feature, which was added to C# recently. I really like that. That's the $sign at the beginning, and then the curly braces, and it allows inserting code into a string.
Yeah, I can format my string without having to use those integer-based formatting statements.
Yep.
So I'm just going to output the information about how long it took to complete the request. So I'll verify that my application has finished rebuilding and restarting over here, and I'll request my page again. If I look at my log, you can see here, beginning request in development, it served the static file, it wasn't modified, completed the request in 9 milliseconds. So I've got all this information now that I'm able to insert and manipulate around my requests by writing a little piece of middleware right here. Now that's a use statement, and a use takes the context and the next item, so it passes on control, and I effectively end up wrapping the middleware, and I'm able to execute things as it comes back up and unwinds the request because these other things have completed. Now, I can do other things in here like mapping. Now, mapping is when I want to branch the request. I want to do something different when a certain thing occurs, right? When I meet a certain criteria.
Okay.
So the simplest format of this is to match a path. So I could match something as simple as contacts. If somebody requests the contacts page, what do you want to do? What do you want that to do? And at this point, I can pass on to a similar type of use or run statement. So let's do that. I will pass on to a run statement, and I will say async context, and this time, there's another paren there. This time I'll just say await context response, write asynchronously, here are your contacts. right?
Okay.
And perhaps I have some code that is going to output some contact information.
Okay.
But I'm really at a low level here interacting with that request
Responding
pipeline.
to a very specific request.
Yeah, very specific format. And right, there's no MVC here. There's no razor views, no controllers. I'm writing code directly against that HTTP request.
Okay.
So now, if I come in here, I can still request index.html, and I get index.html, but I have that map statement for /contacts. So if I go to contacts, I get that occurring,
Okay.
right? If I go somewhere else, if I say contacts for John, it's
doesn't
somewhere else.
match.
It falls all the way down to that run where it says hello world.
Okay.
So now I've mapped and jumped off because I have a path that matches. I can add other conditions in there too. So check this out. Let's go over. I want to add one more check in here. I can say app.mapWhen. And I can check for a specific condition here. So I'm going to take my context and I'm going to say context request.headers. And let's check my user agent, because maybe I want to behave differently for different browsers. And I can say if that contains Firefox,
All right.
I want to specify something else to do. So let's create a Firefox route method to call. And I will create that method for me. And I'll scroll down to that. So this receives an iApplicationBuilder. I'll rename it to app so it looks like those other things that we have. And in this method now, I can actually do those other things that I would want to do. So let's say app.run. And once again, I'll do context.
As you're typing that, one thing that comes to mind with this is because you're showing here that you're refactoring this out to another, out of that whole long list of middleware, you're refactoring it to another method, and I could potentially even put this in another assembly. I could put it in a NuGet package or whatever, right?
Spoiler alert, that's where we're going next. Right? Let's see, I need async here. And await doesn't go there. Await goes over
Yep.
here. All right. So now I'll save that. So looking at the order in which this occurs, right? So if somebody goes to contacts, we're going to write asynchronously, here are your contacts. If they go somewhere else and they're using Firefox, we're going to write out hello Firefox.
All right.
So I'll go to /contacts. Here are your contacts. So now I'll go somewhere else. And I'm getting hello world. What did I do wrong there? So here's what's going on. Let me back up and let's attach the debugger and look at what exactly is going on here. So I'm going to stop this. I'll stop my watch, and I'm going to go over to my code. And now if I put a breakpoint here on this map_when statement, okay, the map_when is actually only executed when it comes down and it hits that during configuration.
When the application is starting up, basically.
Right, when this
Okay.
configuration happens
So
at
that's not going to
startup.
help us debug then because it doesn't show per request.
Exactly. So
we're
let me
stuck.
put a debug point in this one that I am hitting,
Okay.
and now I can inspect and take a look at that header. So now let me start my middleware sample, and I'm going to browse to it this time with Chrome, so I can take a look and see what's going on here,
Okay.
just with a slightly different perspective. See, now I hit the breakpoint on my map_when statement because I'm configuring it. The actual Firefox route isn't triggered yet. All right, so I will click continue, and it steps through. And now, because it's requesting it, I'm breaking at the actual lines here where I'm checking the response type. So now, let's check my user agent header. So if I look at, oops, wrong place, context.requests.headers.
And once you type this, you can zoom in, right?
Yes, let me do that in just a second. And I show that. Check this out. The headers is actually a collection.
Oh.
So I need to look at the first item in the collection and inspect that string. All right.
Okay.
So if I did say 0, it's not going to check it, evaluate it for me. If I set first, it's still not going to let me traverse that here inside this window. So let me fix my code here. So I will change this to say first contains Firefox, then we'll route over to my Firefox route.
Makes sense. Okay.
So let me rerun this one more time.
And are you running in Chrome, or I guess you can pick your browser? Huh?
Let me start in Chrome.
Okay.
So now this is running, and I'm stopped here at my Hello World. And that runs, and inside of Chrome, I get Hello World.
Okay.
Let me go back over to Firefox, and I'll request that location, and I get Hello
Whoa,
Firefox.
Nice. Okay.
So I've detected the browser by checking the user agent string, and I've mapped, I've said, go do this instead inside of my middleware.
Okay, so some bigger picture things that I'm seeing out of this. One, you did that based on headers.
Yes.
So in this case, you were detecting the user agent, but you could detect any kind of header there.
Absolutely.
Anything else about the request. Another thing that I think is really cool that we shouldn't just gloss over is that you can debug them. So this is actually bits of code, and you can go in and you can set breakpoints and you can interact with them. You could also set conditional things that say, if I'm in development, do this. If I'm running in this, whatever it is, right?
Absolutely. So let's do that. Let's actually take our sample here one step further. I'm going to stop this, and let's actually move some of this out into another class and see how we can use that same type of the way we get the use static files. Let's see if we can build that syntax here pretty quickly around some of that information we're doing for our environment information. So what I can do is I can write another class here, and I will call it environment middleware. So let's start creating a class here. Public class environment middleware. Now the thing about middleware is it's not an abstract class or an interface that you're implementing. You're actually implementing one method that's important, and that's the invoke method. So let's create public async task invoke, and invoke takes an HTTP context, and we'll just call it context. I'm going to move my zoom here. Goodbye. Now, for my environment, the way I was logging information about the environment, I want to pass in information about the next delegate that is coming along in the pipeline and the hosting environment. So let me create a constructor using the ctor snippet, and I will receive the request delegate, typically called next by convention, and then information about the hosting environment that we're operating in. So let me save that next delegate into a private field here. I'll create a read-only field for that. And then I'll save off my environment information into another read-only field. Cool. Now, inside of my invoke, I can do almost the exact same things I was doing before here in this method. So let me just copy this directly and paste it in here. Now, I don't have that logger available to me. So let's change this just a little bit and make it a little bit more interactive for folks that aren't accessing this from and being able to see the log. I can say something like context response dot headers add, and then let me add information about my hosting environment name, and then that's a collection of strings. So, yep, new string values, but I'm going to do an anonymous type there, and environment name. All right?
Cool.
So I'm just adding that environment name as a new header. It's a custom header, that's why it has that X there. It's not next, it's this now. I don't have a logger, but wouldn't it be great if I could, oops, I have to pass in the context to my next request.
You need to pass that on.
Yeah, so that the next folks in the line that are listening can receive and interact with that. Since I'm not putting this on the log, I want to put this on a page if it's HTML. So let's just do a quick check and say, if my environment name equals development, right? And I can also do that by saying is development.
Okay.
And my context response content type equals text HTML. Oh, we also need to make sure that content type isn't null. Content type does not equal null. So let me format that a little bit. All right, so if it's not null, if it is text HTML we're writing out, then let's add on to the end of our HTML by saying context, response, write async, and I'll just add a paragraph with some string interpolation that says from environment name in, and then let's complete my timer in elapsed milliseconds.
This is really cool. So you are modifying an HTML response by writing a little bit of custom middleware.
Absolutely. All right, so I've written that into the mix here. That's an async call, so we should await it. There we go. And that's it. So this is going to trigger after this next statement. All right? So let me rerun this one more time. And I'll run this in Chrome. I get my hello world. And let's take a look now at our header information that's coming back. I'll do a refresh. So when I look at localhost, so I don't have my header yet. That's because I didn't hard refresh this page. It's still looking at what's cached. So I'll click back on localhost, and now it's not coming out. I wrote all that class, why isn't it coming out? You actually have to add it into the pipeline. So how do we add that into the pipeline? Well, we have this using statement, this use statement here. That's trash now. We've moved it somewhere else. We can say app.use middleware, and then I like to pass in the generic type here, environment middleware. Okay? So with that statement, let's rerun. And now that's in our pipeline. It's being called, it's being referenced as we work through. And now it says from development in 22 milliseconds. And if I look at my request,
header better be there.
There's my header, X environment name, development. And it's written out for me, and it's also written into this HTML page. It's also not being written over here because what's going on in our page is, yes, that middleware is being called, but that static file clears out and only returns its content. So the things that would have occurred, right,
it's a
coming back
file,
up are blocked because it says, I'm done, the response is completed. That header that it executed and included over here in my middleware before the next being called, this was completed, but because the rest of it was being blocked and it terminated, this code after it did not fire.
Got it.
Make sense?
Yeah.
All right. So now let's do one last thing just so we can get that same syntax we had with the use static files. Let's just put a quick helper method inside of a static class. So
let me guess what you're going to do here. Well, so let you type while I talk here.
Sure, go for it.
You had to go in and you had to say app.use middleware, and you had to give it the generic name, which is okay, but it's a little bit fidgety, and it's not as nice an experience as I see with the other middleware I'm wiring up, where I say app.use MVC and it auto-completes for me.
Yep, you're right.
And if I was passing in custom parameters as well, if I had to pass in a lot of stuff to configure it, that method signature, I might want you to do some work for me to make it easier. Give me some IntelliSense, make it autocomplete.
Right. So I'm just going to lift that same use middleware, environment middleware statement, and just embed it over here so that I could put any other code I need to use to set up that middleware right here.
So now in your startup, you can replace that code that says use middleware with app.use environment middleware.
There you go.
Beautiful.
And it'll still work. So I'll start with the application. Hello world from development in 24 milliseconds.
Very cool.
So that's a little bit about how to write custom middleware. I know the ASP.NET folks have some samples out there for us.
Yeah, I just wanted to show some examples there. As you dig into writing your own custom middleware, it's really helpful to see some production shipping middleware. Fortunately, all this middleware is out on GitHub. So here I'm looking in the basic middleware repo, and they've got several good things in here. They've got ones for they've got ones for like zipping, for all kinds of
for
HTTPS.
compressing your
Exactly.
response.
Yeah. The one I want to show here is the rewrite middleware. What's neat about this is this allows for, there's the mod rewrite, the rewrite rules you can put in your htaccess files if you've used like on Apache, and it's kind of a common syntax. So what they've done here, which I think is really slick, is they have created some custom middleware that will parse these and rewrite in ASP.NET Core.
So that Kestrel will now understand the same rules that we were using on Apache.
Exactly.
Cool.
Which is pretty slick. So here it's able to actually understand if these are just rewrite rules, as text. It also understands them. This is their sample here showing you can add these rewrites in, you can also configure them here in line, which is pretty neat.
Cool. And it understands the IIS rewrite rules that we used to use.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it pulls those in as well. And if you look in at the rewrite middleware itself, it's a bit of code, but it's not crazy. Like it's not hundreds and hundreds of lines of code.
It's another class that starts off with a request delegate next, just like we saw in my environment middleware.
Exactly.
It's taking in a few other things.
Some like passing in a logger and options and stuff. But then in here they set next and options, just the same kind of as you did. And then their invoke is it's a few lines of code, but it's not mind-boggling.
It's not overwhelming.
And so here they're just iterating the rules and applying the rules.
Neat.
And so that's really it. And then at the end, just as you did, they return next and pass the context on to the next one in the delegate.
Cool.
So really cool. And then they also wrote these extension methods so that I can use app.use. Here I do app.use rewriter. So I think this is a great, like, as you want to go on, as you maybe are writing something that's a little bit beyond what you've shown us today, here's some great samples and information about how to do that. One other place I want to point you to is the docs on middleware are pretty comprehensive. They've got some great diagrams explaining, exactly how middleware works and how pass-through works, and explaining all kinds of things about writing your own custom middleware.
Terrific. All right, so we learned a lot about middleware here in this video. Learned about how to configure it, why the order of it is important. We saw how we can take our middleware, write it in an external class, we can write it inline, and we saw some great samples on GitHub. Thanks so much for joining us for this video. We're having a lot of fun writing some code here for ASP.NET Core. I hope you join us for the next one.
Hi, I'm John Galloway.
And I'm Jeff Fritz.
So we're digging into ASP.NET Core, and you're going to be showing us ASP.NET Core configuration.
Yeah, what are the different ways that I can configure my application? There's so much that I want to be able to control about how it starts, how it runs, and I want to be able to access those configuration settings from different places in my application. What are my options there? What can I do with it?
All right.
So let's take a look here on my machine. I've got a couple of things already configured. I've started with a sample application that it was an ASP.NET application using Razor pages. And I've got a couple of things written out here that I want to show you. First off is if I want to actually grab my configuration and have that strongly typed configuration class, I can write a class, a normal class. It's a plain old CLR class here. And I'm going to provide two properties inside of this configuration class. I'm going to specify my menu bar background color and then the text color that I want to set for my menu bar in my application.
Okay.
So this class, it's pretty simple. It's using default property values so that I can set that I want a black background with white text. And inside of my startup class, I can configure that based on the configuration that's available in my application by using this services.configure method inside of my configure services method. I'm going to configure a my configuration class using the section from my configuration that's labeled from my configuration collection called my configuration. So right now inside of my app settings JSON, I don't have a my configuration section. So when I run this application right now with these settings, let me just .NET run that. And I will copy this location and go over to my browser. I will go over to Firefox here and let's paste that in. And you'll see that I get a configuration sample information. This is the stuff that I wrote into the middle of my page. My header is black. I've got some information being dumped out on the footer. Now let's take a look at how I'm getting my configuration information into this page. Let me go back to my code. I'll go over to the pages and I want to show you the layout. Now the layout, I'm injecting the configuration object and I'm also going to inject my configuration options so that my configuration class is actually being wrapped by an iOptions object, and I can get back my configuration class fully populated with whatever configuration information it read by accessing my config options.value. And then to make this demo a little bit interesting so that you can see how we're using configuration inside of code, I'm just echoing the menu background color for my nav bar color, and I'm echoing the text color and making both of those items important in my CSS here inside of my layout. Now, this could be a connection string for your application. This could be client ID access information to access a third-party provider. Maybe it's something like a SendGrid or Twitter. Mm-hmm. Those things can be configured in your configuration and used elsewhere in your code by putting them into a strongly typed class like this. The last thing that I want to show is the environment variables are being loaded up from my application, and by default, things like the Windows computer name environment variable is being added to my configuration, and I can see that here in the footer, Jeff's Yoga. That's the name of my machine. I'm accessing that by using this indexer to grab that configuration piece of information and write it out to the page. But now let's start changing things up a little bit. We know that we read from app settings, so let's write a section into app settings for my configuration. This is JSON, so I will add a JSON group here, and we will have menu bar BG color, and we will specify, let's start, I want to make the background green, and then my menu bar color, the text color, let's make it black. All right, make sure I put that comma in there. So now I have properly formatted app settings. I'll go over here and I will restart my application so that we load up that new configuration. And I'll refresh my page. And of course my header turns green with black text because now I'm reading settings from app settings JSON. But we actually have configuration by default inside of our ASP.NET Core application that will read an app settings.environmentName.json, and we can override whatever's inside of app settings. This is the next step in our configuration hierarchy.
So that's really useful because I can say, like, this is my main app settings that I'm going to be deploying to my server, but when I'm in development, I want to override some of those settings. Not all of them, but maybe just a few of them.
Maybe just a few. So I'm going to copy out this my configuration section, go over into my app settings development JSON file. This is the default file that we provide for you when you're building inside of Visual Studio. And I'm going to change my menu background color to purple, and let's make this light gray so that we can still read. Let me restart my application. And I'll browse to my application now, and now I get the purple background. So the configuration for the green with black text is still there, but this one is loaded second. So this one will overlay that other configuration. Now, I mentioned things like Twitter passwords or connection strings that might be important to you. We know, and we talked a little bit about putting those into user secrets. User secrets are a configuration option that's loaded next, and it should live in a file that's outside of our project. So I'm going to right-click on my project here in Visual Studio, and I'm going to choose Manage User Secrets, and I get an empty JSON file called secrets.json. I'm going to paste in my configuration here, and let's change this up a little bit. This is my secure information, so I will make the background color red and the menu bar color white. I still have my other configuration settings out there, but I've added user secrets. These will be loaded if there are user secrets present and we're in development mode. So now I'll go back to my page and I'll refresh, and now I get the red with white text. So I've got 3 different configurations coming in, and this is the order in which they're overriding each other and changing my configuration.
Okay, so the difference, just to make sure I got it, the difference between the app settings development and secrets. App settings development is included in the code that I may be checking into source control, that kind of thing, right?
Yes.
And the user secrets, that's somewhere else.
That's kept somewhere else on disk. You shouldn't be checking it into source control. You don't want folks to be able to see your passwords and things inside of source control.
Okay.
But in this case, just to illustrate that this is in a different place, I'm just changing the color of the navigation bar.
Great. Okay.
So the next thing, we already saw that it's loading the environment variables like my computer name there in the footer. I can access and send in environment variables to overwrite those different settings. So check this out. I might have in my environment something that will set up environment variables like my configuration, menu bar BG color is yellow, menu bar color is black, and these environment settings are things that our operations folks can set up on the server either by having some sort of a script file like this, or maybe they set it up right in their Windows configuration, or in different service configurations in Linux as the web service is starting up. So I'm going to go back to my console window here, and I'm going to run this set environment command, and it's got a couple extra spaces in there that it's not happy about. Let me just copy these settings in. There we go. Now notice that configuration setting is hierarchical. So how do we define that hierarchy that we're setting my configuration and then these items inside of it? You separate them by using a double underscore between each one of the pieces of that configuration key we want to configure. So I'll .NET run again, and this time with those environment variables in place, I should see a yellow navigation bar with black text because it's coming from my environment variable settings. Now this is also really powerful on Azure App Service because we have that console on Azure where you see all the environment variables that are being configured specifically for my application, and I can add in this case, my configuration menu bar BG color on Azure and set those settings appropriately. Now, there's one final place I want to show you that you can add configuration to override things. Environment variables is the last thing in the stack that's being configured inside of ASP.NET Core. IIS has their own configuration settings that they will load up from within web config when my application is running inside of IIS. So the Internet Information Server on Windows uses something called the ASP.NET Core module, and it has a web config that looks like this when it runs my application. I can place inside of here an entry for environment variables that are specific just to this process that we're hosting that's running our Kestrel web server for ASP.NET Core. So I will add an environment variable, and I'm going to use those same names that I had before. My configuration, menu bar, BG color, and I'll specify the value of that environment variable. Let's make it sky blue. I'll create one more environment variable. This is my configuration, menu bar color, and this time we're going to make that black. All right? So now, if I restart over here inside of my console window, and I'm going to browse back to my application, this time I still get the yellow and black. And I get the yellow and black because I'm running inside of Kestrel, not inside of IIS. So let me go back one more time. I'm going to run this using IIS Express, so it reads my web config and parses these environment variables for the .NET process that it's hosting. So I'll launch the IIS Express instance. It's going to use my web config that I wrote, starting my browser, and now I get the sky blue with black. So I've written a configuration specifically for the web server to use. It's being parsed and added in. That gives you a level of configuration if you want to do something specific to IIS only for this process, because you don't want to share those environment variables with other processes, perhaps in a shared hosting environment.
Right.
But we have all these different options we can work with. Okay? So to recap, we set configuration for our application from a half dozen different places, whether it was app settings JSON, app settings with the environment name .json, in this case development, but I could also write an app settings.staging if I have configuration information that's specific to my staging environment that I want my testers to be able to work with. I can also have app settings production.json that my DevOps folks manage in the production space. I can set environment variables. I can use user secrets to hide things on just the development machine. And those environment variables can be set specifically for the web server in the web server process. That's a lot of flexibility and a lot of options. I've accessed my configuration on my page, both with an indexer by saying computer name inside of the configuration object, and also by creating that my configuration strongly typed class that had properties defined for those things inside of it. Pretty cool stuff.
You know, some things that you showed that I think are really worthwhile. One is I've got a lot of flexibility. So as I'm developing, I can say, this is how I want to work in production, this is how I want to work locally and all that. Another thing is it makes it a lot easier to be secure and not accidentally checking my passwords and secrets into source control because of things like I can put locally when I develop, I can put those in my user secrets, and in production, say on Azure, I can create those as environment settings, environment variables, or I can create those, in whatever my server is, set those up as environment variables. It's a much better, it kind of pushes you away from putting those things you don't want to accidentally share, makes it easier for you to keep them locally in your environment and in your production environments as well.
It's very, very flexible.
Very powerful.
You can use those same things when you start using other tools like Docker containers. We can inject our environment variables that way as well.
Great.
Cool stuff.
Thanks for joining us. I hope you'll stick around for some more videos on ASP.NET Core.
Hey there, welcome back to this ASP.NET Core video series. My name is Jeff Fritz.
I'm John Galloway.
And you know what, John? We've spent a lot of time writing code, writing some HTML into Razor templates or Razor pages, and that's a lot of code that I have to write. What if I wanted to reuse some of that?
Yeah, let me tell you, recently I ran into this where I was working on the .NET Foundation website.
Oh, okay.
And the index view for the home page, there's a lot of information there. There's all kinds of stuff, and some parts of it are things like a little news view, or a little list of recent blog posts. And there are some frustrating things with this. One is, my view is huge. Tons of, I'm scrolling to get to it. I don't like that. Another problem, and I can break it apart with partials, but it just kind of moves the problem. It doesn't really fix things. Another thing is, I want to componentize so I can reuse, like you said, and I also don't want my controllers or my page code behinds to have to return really complex models that have all kinds of, here's my list of news, here's my list of blog posts, and then if I want to implement it somewhere else on the site, I've got to do that all over again.
Yeah, that's difficult. Okay,
yeah.
So what's the solution for that?
Well, so we talked about this, and I thought it was fun kind of running through the list with you. You know, we were talking about like, well, we could do partials, we could do, there's child actions which are available. Child actions work for MVC, and with the child action, you can put inside a controller. You can say this is just for a partial view that's going to be returned by this controller. But the problem there is it's still tied directly to a controller.
Right.
And then you mentioned tag helpers, and tag helpers is a nice solution. A tag helper can I can create a nice little markup, and I can say write this thing out. The problem, kind of, with a tag helper is I lose the razor formatting.
Okay.
Right?
You have to write all your code, all your formatting in C#.
Yeah, a tag helper is written in C#, and so I'm formatting strings into HTML. That's not beautiful.
No.
So the solution here is a view component.
Okay.
A view component's really cool because it allows me to make a small little component. It's standalone. It doesn't do the whole model binding kind of thing that I would use in Pages or MVC, but it is something I can just drop into any view. It works all by itself. And the nice thing with it is there's a simple class, and it has all dependency injection, it has all my services available, and then it's also got an associated Razor template.
Very cool.
So I get the benefits of working in Razor. I get I can write nice componentized code in a class and drop it in wherever.
Cool. Let's take a look.
Yeah. So here, let me show an example. This is actually the page I was talking about. So this is an example homepage. Think of your homepage of your website, right? And there's tons of different stuff. And as I'm scrolling through, here's a list of news on the left, list of events on the right. So those are some kind of drop-in things. If I look down at the bottom, here again, I've got a list of recent posts. These are things that you may consider some other things like, and on the docs, which are pretty good for this here, they list some things like you may have something like a tab cloud or a shopping cart, something where you want to drop it into a page, and it's not just, if it's just a chunk of markup, I would use just a partial for that. But if it's something where you've actually got something to populate here, like a shopping cart list, I really do think it makes sense to have some code behind for it.
You need that server-side code to interact with.
Exactly.
Okay.
So what I'm going to be talking through here, I refer you to the docs. If you go to View Components, there's information about what a view component is, and it talks you through building a view component. And there's actually a whole walkthrough down at the end creating a simple view component. So I've actually got that running locally, and let's take a look at what the code, how that code looks. So here we've got this is a standard view. Down at the bottom, we've got this await invoke async, and it's a priority list. It says component invoke async. So it's pulling in this view component that way. If we look at how that view component is defined, we have here, it's a class that inherits from view component. And then it just has it's got a get items async. So really there's not a lot of code here. What's nice is it's able to, it can use dependency injection. So here they're using a data context and just injecting that there. You can also inject other services, loggers, etc.
Sure.
And so all this is doing is returning a list. So this is async, so it's returning a list of to-do items as a task. Then in the view for that, it's just binding to it. So this is just very simple binding. Here we've got an enumerable, and we're just binding to that enumerable list. And there is some convention to this. This is called default.cshtml. And the kind of naming convention here is you have components. Priority list is it's a priority list view component, and then it's called default.cshtml.
So this is very similar to how we have the views folder above.
Exactly.
And this is the views for a component being hosted inside of a to-do controller.
Yes, and this sample shows multiple ways of hosting, so there's actually some different names on these.
Oh,
but
okay.
this one also is, the standard would be default CSHTML, and you can put that either in shared or in the view specific one.
In the controller specific one.
Controller specific, exactly.
So,
Yep.
so this way I can use the same component, change the markup slightly based on my different controllers' needs.
Exactly. So I could have a shared one that's the standard one, and then within other controllers, I can go in and mark that up a bit.
Terrific.
So this really is pretty straightforward. Now, because this isn't depending on anything else in order to display it, I can drop it into any Razor view. So the kind of simple way to inject this, simple meaning the default standard way, is I'm doing component invoke async. And then since I don't have model binding, I'm actually passing in parameters here.
Sure.
So I'm saying this is, the priority to take, and this is whether show if they're done or not, right?
Okay.
Because this is for a to-do list. This is okay, but I actually prefer to show this using a tag helper. This is pretty slick because tag helpers clean up ugly Razor markup. That's what they do, right?
Yes.
So here they've actually got, if I do VC colon, it automatically, like view components just automatically become tag helpers.
Okay.
So it's just built in. So just by creating priority lists, VC priority list automatically works. And all my properties here also are automatically bound for me.
So we're getting those hyphens between the names of our attributes and the name of our tag helper because that's where the boundary is between the capitalized words in the name.
Yeah,
cool.
So it does that conversion for me. So that's pretty cool. Let me show you an example then, kind of to round back to how I use this in mine. So I had some markup that looked like this. This is just kind of staging markup, right? But so where I'm showing those news items, and this is, it's using Bootstrap. I'm using Holder.js to show different kind of marker or like thumbnails for them. I'm using, so with Bootstrap, I've got media heading, media body, pull left, all that kind of stuff, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I would not want to generate this all in C#, but there's actually a reasonable amount of code that's pulling this. It's actually pulling it from RSS feeds and stuff. So here I've got a newsfeed service, and my newsfeed service is it's running this kind of background task. It's actually using syndication, the syndication feed, which just was made available in .NET Standard 2 recently, which is very cool. So it's kind of running this, and this is a service that I've got. So then I've got in my component, I'm able to inject that. So I inject my service, using constructor injection. So I set that new service there, and then I just call my invoke async. This one is simpler than that other one, the to-do list we were showing. It's not hitting a database or whatever. The service is doing the hard work here. So it's just getting the feed. The feed is cached behind the scenes in the service, and it's grabbing a quantity, and that quantity is being passed in here. Actually, it's an
input parameter.
It's an input parameter, exactly. So I can say this is how many news items I want to show, and then I can go over and here's my actual. This is how I converted it in to Razor. So I just am binding to my enumerable news items. And then I'm just using my standard Razor, and I'm doing a few things. Like I'm saying, take just, like for instance, there's multiple URIs associated with the news feed because there's also an RSS feed for comments and stuff like that. So I'm grabbing the first. And then here on the description, I'm taking the first 50 characters, right? So, but basically that's all that's involved in setting that up.
So this is the Razor template that your component is rendering with.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so then that, just to kind of show where that goes, that is in, let me see, news view right there. It's default CSHTML.
Okay.
Right? So that's it. So really pretty straightforward. It solves a problem that when you run into it, you'll say, man, I wish I could package this up. I don't want to have to. If you find yourself from a page or a controller returning a very complex model that has, here's a list of these and here's a list of those and all that, that's kind of a sign that you may want to move that into a component. And then if you've got reusable code that you just want to reuse through your site.
Yeah. So this isn't really a construct, this isn't a view structure like tag helpers that we would want to bundle up into a NuGet package and deploy, because I've got that Razor template that I need to deploy appropriately inside my application.
Exactly. Yeah, I think this is something where it's more kind of application specific. There may be some, super black belt way of doing some kind of path provider, blah, 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 to inject that. But I think the standard case is to just go through, clean up my markup, and take common things I'm going to use through my site, put the Razor template there, put my one class, write my one simple class, and then just reuse through my site there.
Terrific.
All right, so that's about it. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you join us for the next video on ASP.NET Core.
Hey there, welcome back to this video about ASP.NET Core. My name is Jeff Fritz.
I'm John Galloway.
And we've been talking a lot in these videos about building new applications and what we can do with them, and then we even got into talking a little bit about production and different environments. How do I host this stuff if I want to actually publish it and put it somewhere in a production space, John?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's a lot of information, a lot of nuances to this, right? Deploying has gotten a little more complicated because ASP.NET Core runs everywhere.
Yeah.
And so you have to think about, how is your application actually hosted, and where are you deploying it to, and the slight differences between the places you can deploy to.
Okay.
So to start with, we're going to talk about actually hosting in ASP.NET Core. And an interesting thing here is that ASP.NET Core is actually hosted using Kestrel.
Okay.
And Kestrel is a lightweight web server package. It's actually a NuGet package that I add to my application that kind of turns on HTTP serving. It's a managed HTTP server that lives inside of my application. So the common things to any environment is you'll set up a host, and then once you'll publish your application to a folder on there, you'll have a process manager that's going to make sure that my application continues running.
Okay.
And then I'm going to have a reverse proxy that's going to send the traffic back to me.
Okay.
So that whole thing about how I'm actually publishing and how my application is hosting itself this is done using Kestrel. So to see this in action, let's take a look at a default project. This is just file new project.
Okay.
And I've got, if I look in my NuGet packages, I've got the ASP.NET Core all meta package.
Sure.
And if I expand this out, somewhere in that list we've got Kestrel. So you actually don't need to install Kestrel in your application. File new web is going to have Kestrel enabled by default.
Right, because that package is included as part of that ASP.NET Core.all meta package that has everything in the kitchen sink.
Yep, and I could actually just create a console application and then add this Kestrel package, and my application is now a web app.
Oh, cool.
Right, so that's pretty neat. So if we hop back out of there and we look at our startup, our program CS, what we've got here is the actual spinning up Kestrel. And
you mentioned if you could start a console application and add the web server to it. This looks like a normal static void main for a console application.
It completely is.
Oh.
No trickery at all. This is literally a console app that has some additional NuGet packages added. And because of that, we've got Microsoft ASP.NET Core hosting, and that's able to run Kestrel and host our application.
Cool.
So in previous releases, before ASP.NET Core 2, there was a lot more code in here. And it was pretty much boilerplate. You always did the same things. You always said, here, use these environment settings and do this and do that. So what they've done, and I like this, it's definitely simplified things quite a bit for me, is they've got a default web host builder. You'll see here, web host create default builder. And for the most part, I can just use this and go on about my merry way. If I do want to go in and configure things, I can just type dot, and then I can start, I can go in here and I can configure specifics about how things work. But for the most part, I can start with this default web host builder, and I'm pretty set.
Cool.
If I do want to dig into what else is available, in the GitHub ASP.NET hosting repo, there's a sample which has some additional hosting configurations. So here's one where they show, for instance, if I want to point other URLs, if I want to say, I want my application to respond to 5000 and 5001, or if I want to respond only to this on HTTPS or other things. This is an example of how I could go in and do that. So I'm just dotting in and adding and making additional calls to the web host builder.
Cool.
And for an example, taking this even farther, this is one where it's a sample where it's doing all kinds of additional configuration, adding in specific configuration steps. We're doing things like using a specific content root. So the content root is where my www root folder points to.
Okay.
And I could point this somewhere else, right? Here we're doing some additional use URLs, one for HTTP and one for HTTPS. You can, in code, you could set a different development environment, just all kinds of different things. So here we're configuring services in line here. Your services are normally configured in a startup class, but if you look at it, if we go back over to it in here, when this calls use startup, that's actually just a convention for like a nice way to clean up my program CS so all the code isn't in there, right? So I really could configure in line here if I had a need to. So this is an example of doing that sort of thing. So here in this example, they're using a fake server, and that's just for testing. They're running a local one. There's other options. There's things like this HTTP+CSS server.
Right. So that's built on top of the HTTP.sys kernel mode driver inside of Windows that will serve web interactions, web concerns from there. Very cool to give you all the power of Windows web serving using a new server that's built with .NET, completely managed, and running here inside of your ASP.NET Core app.
Cool. So to summarize what we've covered so far, we've got a NuGet package called Kestrel. We are pulling it into our application, which really was just a console app, and then we said, pull in this NuGet package, and then configure it, and now my console application is a web server.
Pretty cool.
Pretty neat. So now that we've got that, we can look at where are we going to deploy this to. And as I mentioned before, there's those steps to it. So number one, we've got our host set up. Then there are other things that, now we want to get this out onto them and run them. So we publish to a folder. And if I right-click publish in Visual Studio, or if I publish using the Azure tools, et cetera, a lot of those things are kind of handled for me, but all I need to do from command line is type .NET publish, and that's going to publish just the code that I'm going to want to deploy.
All right.
So after that, there's kind of different steps for the different environments as far as how my process is monitored and what the reverse proxy is, how it's actually, what the web server is that's kind of feeding things into Kestrel.
Right, so that reverse proxy is a front-end, commercial-grade web server like Apache, Nginx, or IIS that's going to receive those initial requests. Maybe it'll handle those SSL interactions, any kind of other security concerns, and then turn around and submit that request back to Kestrel, much the same way that folks in the Node environment use Express.
Exactly. And then, my application is concerned with just serving HTTP, and all those kind of other higher level things that I may want to do in a, like you said, a commercial grade web server, I can handle that stuff there. So as we kind of go through some of the different options for deploying. So IIS, this is a long article here about setting up IIS, and there are a decent amount of steps to this, which is one reason, honestly, that I like deploying to Azure, because I can just push it to Azure and let them worry about that.
Let them configure it for you, and they take all those predefined defaults, the best practices for you.
Yep, and handle things like Windows Update and stuff.
Yes.
Right. But so these are kind of the examples here. This is walking me through setting up IIS. There is an ASP.NET Core. There's a .NET Core Windows Server Hosting Bundle. And this is an exe. This is something that I would install on my server, my web server, and it'll actually go through and configure things for me.
So if you were setting up a VM in Azure, or if you had an on-prem server that you were configuring IIS on to also have .NET Core hosting, you would use this .NET Core Windows Server hosting bundle to put down those features from ASP.NET Core we need in order to host a website.
Exactly. So the way this is done in IIS after I've installed that is it's actually using this ASP.NET Core module. And the ASP.NET Core module is actually doing this proxy for me. So if we look at it, here's the internet, IIS is that front end, and it's actually got this core module that it's running, and that core module is calling back into my application. And then as we see here, here's my application, and it's actually got Kestrel as kind of the front end that's calling back and forth into my application code.
Cool.
So yeah, so this is really interesting, and of course, this is, like I said, this is installed by that server install thing for me, so that'll kind of set it up for me with IIS. So that's how it's done there, and that's kind of the main way that you're going to be doing this. There are some other options available, though. There's the option to host in a Windows service, which is pretty neat. So there's actually a package that I'm able to install that can set that up. This is the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Hosting.Windows Services package. And so if I add that into my application here, so you'll see this is got that pulled in, and then it's actually pretty similar on start. There's a few things we're doing here. We're saying the very simplest case is you basically run it and it's configured as a service. However, a lot of the time I want to actually be able to debug it in build. Like I want to, as I'm developing my application, I want to be able to kind of step into the code, debug, and all that kind of stuff. So kind of the recommended way, and this is shown in the docs, is to set it up where you can say, allow it to run in dual mode, either as a console app or as a service.
Okay.
So the way this is configured here, this is saying if a debugger is attached, or if I pass in the command line arguments --console, then set this is service to false. And then it runs slightly differently. If it says if it is a service, then it kind of sets things for directory path. The directory path is different, right? And then also there's this host.run as custom service. So this is what's pulled in via that NuGet package. So this is the standard Kestrel run, but if we're running if as service, then it does this run as custom service.
Okay.
And then the way that's registered is actually using this sc command. So if we take a look, I've actually got this, here, jump over into the folder, and I set this up using a batch file, and only because this is a few lines of code to type here. So if we look, so this is sc create. So that's sc is the thing to kind of register a service. So I say sc create, the name of the service, and then bin path. And the one thing that's a little interesting, this bin path, I've actually used .NET publish. So in my application, from command line, I did .NET publish, and then I've copied that path where the exe was published to. Okay. So now I'm going to take this service and I will do run as administrator. And that's now running. That's like it's registered as a service. And so now if I go to localhost 5000, my favorite localhost port. So there's my service running. This is being hosted as a service, a Windows service. So the Windows service is handling the, keeping my process running, handling the start, stop, all that kind of stuff.
So this is a lot like how we would do those self-contained deployments with WCF services back in the past.
Yep, exactly. So again, if I'm exposing something out on the internet, I would generally I would use IIS, right?
Sure.
But for something that I need to host locally, have a service that's running, expose some local content, et cetera, that's kind of how I can set that up.
Neat.
So yeah, and that sample is out. That's actually linked to from the docs here.
Okay.
So relatively straightforward. And that SC, I was honestly kind of surprised when I, did the SC running through this SC service add, and it just kind of worked. SC create. So, and then at the end also you'll want to go through and clean it up, remove it, and that's there's an SC delete to do that. You stop it and delete it. So that is those. So the one other thing I kind of wanted to touch on, and this is a bigger thing, I'm just going to point you in the direction to get started, but is hosting on Linux. Hosting on Linux, again, you're configuring an entire web server, you're setting up your process monitor, and you're doing your reverse proxy.
Okay.
So there's several steps there. I just want to point out, I ran through this, and I just want to point out some gotchas and important things to be aware of, right? And also some tips. So one is, I went in and I actually did this I created an Ubuntu VM, and I did my kind of development on that machine as far as kind of configuring it. I actually used the Cloud Shell. So this Cloud Shell you can just bring up by clicking here, and this kind of launches this little terminal window down at the bottom.
Okay.
So that's actually where I did my configuration. In order to do that, I SSH'd into the box.
Okay.
So I actually just, copy, it's in the directions as far as how to do it, but I SSH'd into the box, and then they walk you through installing. Now, you can install the full SDK, but actually what's recommended is to install just the runtime, right?
Sure.
You don't want to install the whole SDK on your server. You don't need it. And you want to kind of have a light, tight install, right? So when you go to the downloads, and kind of the default it's going to point you to is SDK. If you click on runtime, then you can scroll down and you can see here Linux, installing .NET Core on Linux. And then here, be careful that you read the version number. So this is .NET Core 114 LTS. That's long-term support, right? So you actually do, if you want .NET Core 2, you want to scroll down to current. And then for these, it's literally just sudo apt-get. You have to configure the sources for it first. Those sources are these standard ones here. So if you go downloads, .NET Core, and then you click on Linux, you're still going to need to make sure that for whatever your environment is, that you've done your apt-get, like you've configured your sources for apt-get.
Right.
Right. So I went through and registered the Microsoft signature. Go through, and then install apt-get using this. However, when I got to this line here, where you would run the entire SDK, that's where instead you install that runtime.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So that's kind of the main thing as far as how you deploy. Obviously, I recommend still deploying using continuous integration, using some sort of like deploy from GitHub or that kind of thing. That's kind of nice to configure that. When you're in development, one nice thing that you can do, if you're developing on Windows, you can actually use Bash and Ubuntu on Windows. So I went through and locally did this on my machine. .NET, and I actually have .NET or CD. And so I did through here .NET Publish. So it's in a subdirectory off of bin, cd bin, debug, and then down underneath, it's several levels deep, but there's a publish directory, right? And then as far as how you get your files out on your production server, what I did locally in development is use SCP. There's information in the docs about how to do that. And so basically, RP is recursive. So I'm pointing to a directory. I'm saying SCP from this local directory to my Azure VMs directory. And I just created an app directory and did SCP to it.
Just copied it out.
So yeah, that's kind of a standard way to deploy or to copy files up. So once I had that in place, then that's my application's running on that server.
Okay.
And so then to actually run it, it's .NET, and then just the DLL name.
Right.
After that, though, you're not done because remember, you've got to go through and do all the actual hosting steps in here. So you're actually just, your application is copied up there, but now you've got to have your monitoring, and you also need to handle your reverse proxy. So we're not going to go through all that now. I'm just showing you kind of the basics of how to get started and how to get it, get it running, and important considerations you've got.
Sure. Okay.
So we have covered, starting with the basics of how your application is hosted itself, how Kestrel is running your application or is enabling HTTP serving inside your application.
Right.
And we looked at how you configure that, how you can set up some of the different Kestrel options. You've got your default web host builder to start with, but you can go through and configure a lot of different things, and we looked at some sample code for that. After that, we looked at how we're deploying to a few different hosting environments. So we looked at IIS, we looked at hosting locally as a Windows service, and we looked at some kind of things to be aware of for deploying to Ubuntu as well.
Cool. All right. Well, we covered a lot there, and I learned a lot about hosting an ASP.NET Core service. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you follow up with some of the other videos that we have in our ASP.NET Core series for you.
Hi, welcome back to this video series on ASP.NET Core. I'm John Galloway.
And I'm Jeff Fritz.
So we're going to be talking here about configuring and working with multiple environments.
Yeah, we've kicked around this notion of production and development, and it's funny, ASP.NET Core actually knows what these things mean, and we can light up different features based on which environment we're operating in.
That's one of those things where when you think back about it, we're always working with, like you said, there's development, there's staging or test, and there's production, and it's nice to have the web framework understand that and know about that and work with me.
Absolutely. I like being able to enable and disable features based on where I am.
Great.
Let's take a look. So here I am in Visual Studio. I'm going to start up a new project, and I'll choose to build a new ASP.NET Core application. I'm going to put it in my dev folder, and we will call this environments. Now, I'm going to create an empty project because I want to focus on the different things that are available in the environments. So it's created very quickly for me, and I'll bring up my program CS to start. And you can see here, all that we're doing right from the get-go is create my default builder, use my startup class, and build. Well, that startup class has just a few things configured, and our first feature that's only enabled in development environment is right here on line 23 through 26, where it says, if the environment is development, then use the developer exception page. And that's great for when I'm debugging, and I want to be able to see the exact stack trace of what happened inside of my application. When I want to deploy this to my production space, I'd rather use a more friendly error handler that shows some nice information to my visitors so they don't get to see that ugly stack trace. I tell you, John, it was the scariest thing when I was at an airport and one of those display screens showing the departure times for all the flights was showing the old ASP.NET error page.
Uh-oh, the yellow screen of death.
The old yellow screen of death.
Oh no, you don't want to see that anywhere, but especially not at the airport.
And not at the airport. So this is a good comfort thing to only show that developer exception page when you're in development mode.
Sounds
it
good to me.
improves confidence. So this configure method runs when I configure my pipeline, right, my HTTP pipeline on a normal application, and I have this one startup class. And if I navigate to this, right, and I'm just going to throw an exception here, right? That was an error, and I'm going to run this. So when I run this now from my command line, you'll see it's going to do the compile, and it's going to come back and say that it's running in the development environment and it's listening on this web address and port.
Okay.
Let me copy that, and I'm going to navigate there with my browser. And right, this is that that error message that I was expecting to see, right? This is the developer exception page.
Because you're in development, you want to see that. So you can fix it.
So I can fix that, right? So my hosting environment is development, and I get my development feature enabled. Now, I can change that, and I can turn on a different environment by setting an environment variable. And in fact, Visual Studio did that for me when I configured the application. Check this out. I'm going to go to Project, Properties, and I will look at Debug. And right here in the middle of my screen, there we go, it sets up an environment variable when I launch from within Visual Studio that says ASP.NET Core _ environment is development. So whenever I'm debugging from Visual Studio, I'm going to get all those development features that I've configured inside of my application. But I'm not running from within Visual Studio, I'm running from my command line. The next feature that Visual Studio lit up for me is inside of my properties of the project, it generated a file called launch settings. And this is a bunch of settings that are used when you're launching your application to set the various things that actually we saw in a previous video around how to host your application, what is the application URL that you're listening on, and even some environment variables right here. So we've got hard-coded into this configuration that we're in development mode. So because I ran from the command line, it actually ran this set of configuration options into my project so that I was listening on 63.439, and it set my environment to development.
Nice. Okay.
So if I want that to not be set by default from inside of this file, I can clear that out. I'll clear this. And now if I execute .NET Run, so I executed .NET Run, and you see it's now saying the hosting environment is production. So when I don't specify an ASP.NET Core environment, it defaults to thinking it's running in production, which means all those places where we said, if this is development, put in these extra features, those things go away, and it'll behave more like a production server where we'll start turning on some features that make it a little bit more secure. It hardens ASP.NET Core and makes it feel more production ready. So now let me go back to my website, and when I refresh, I don't get my error. There was nothing to return. It threw the error, and in fact, that error is here inside my log, but it didn't finish, and to prevent any of that information from leaking outside my application, it didn't return a thing. It kept the screen blank, nothing happened here.
Great. Okay.
So if I did have an error check in there, I could go route appropriately to some other location.
Some pretty professional looking error page.
Absolutely, that fits in with the rest of my application and isn't a yellow screen of doom like I saw at the airport.
Maybe something like an animated GIF of a man with a shovel, like a construction. Something
1997's website called John. They want you back. All right, so that's how you can configure your web, how you can light up that development feature, but there's also some other things we can do here as we build our application to actually pivot and bring in different features and configure for different environments. So we know there's an isDevelopment method. There's also isProduction or isStaging, and those test to see if the environment is named production or staging. That kind of makes sense. But this last one here that I want to point out is environment. This is the interesting one because I can provide my own string name for an environment that I want to test against. So development, production, staging, those might not be the terms that you use with your organization. You might use a different name like test or integration, right? Or, right, whatever your organization uses for your environment names, you can create and put those same tests in here to verify that you're operating in that environment before you light up different features. Now, that's one thing to pivot and put in if statements to verify and configure things however you'd like, but you can actually go even a step further where I have a startup class here. I can actually change my configure services so that it triggers a configure services that exists and is written for my development environment by calling it configure services development. And because I've put the name of my environment at the end of that method name, it'll find this and execute this when it's in development mode. Now you're probably going to want to have a configure services method hanging around also in case it can't find an environment name that matches one of your overrides that you have here. You can use that same trick with the configure method, in order to provide a feature that's specific to being in that environment. So, tell you what, let me just copy this, and I'm going to go down here and add another method, and this time I'll call it configure development. And instead of configuring all that other stuff in the pipeline, I'm actually just going to say app.run async context, right? And then I will say await context response, write async hello from development. Semicolon, good. Now let me rerun that application. So now it thinks I'm in production. I'll refresh and I still get my blank page. So now let's cancel this. Let me set my ASP.NET Core environment to development and rerun the application. And now it thinks I'm in the development environment. So I'll go back, refresh, and it says hello from development. So I can embed different configuration methods that point to and configure my application differently depending on which environment I'm in. So those are options that you can choose to use as you're building out your application. One last trick with that I want to make sure you see. I'm going to go back into my code here, and besides having a configure development method, right, I'll get rid of that. I can actually have a different startup class sitting here as well. So check this out. If I create public class startup development, right, I need a configure services and a configure method in there, so I will just start off by copying these. All right. And in this one, I will do the exact same app.run async context await context response write, and this time we will say hello from startup development. All right, semi to finish it. Now, in order for me to be able to use this startup class and have it detect and use the startup class that I want based on the environment name, I need to make a slight change here from where it says use startup and specifies a specific startup class. I need to tell it instead what assembly to go search for this startup class in and run the appropriate one. So my assembly is called environments, so I will just call it environments, and it will go find the appropriate startup class for me to run. So I will cancel this. I'll .NET run again. So it thinks I'm running in the development environment. I'll refresh from over here, and it says hello from startup development. So we've written a little bit of code that is able to interpret what environment we're on, use different features around the startup class as needed for those different environments, and trigger different configurations as needed, okay? This is a great configuration option for folks who have different needs in different environments. Maybe you're in a regulated environment and your production space is governed by HIPAA rules, and there's certain things that you only want to light up in development that can never get into production. You can do things around writing a startup production class that excludes all of those development things that nobody can change, and you can make sure is the one that runs every time when you get into production.
I can see all kinds of uses. Like you showed the development exception page. I may want to have some sample data. Maybe when I'm running in development mode, I want to have a ton of data that's going to, because I'm all on a local network and I want my developers to feel the pain of loading a large page or whatever, whatever it is. Or I may want to show, it's pretty common to show profiling information on my page in development, right? And I can see like, what is my page running and loading quickly? That kind of profiling, and then when I'm in production, I may want to dial that down. So, I love that you showed all those different ways, and then how I can use those custom startup classes to kind of formalize that.
Yep. The last thing, the Visual Studio browser link tool is enabled by default using that same mechanism where it checks if it's development mode in the default application templates as well.
You know, that's one other thing you pointed out there is that I can set breakpoints and I can actually step through and say like is in development or whatever. That's a neat thing there, is that code is actually, it's code. So I can debug it, I can you know, change it or work with it as I'm developing.
Yep. So thanks so much for joining us for this video about different environments that you may be working on. We have a couple more videos about ASP.NET Core for you. I hope you come back and join us. Hey, welcome back to this video series about ASP.NET Core. My name is Jeff Fritz.
And I'm John Galloway. And
John, you know what? We're both Americans. And
although you tried to be a Canadian.
I tried to be a Canadian earlier. Failed. But I barely speak English well, let alone another language. And I know a lot of the folks out there, I'm sure you don't speak English as your first language. How do we go about localizing and making sure that our ASP.NET Core web applications work better for those folks who aren't American and aren't English?
You know, that's a great question, and it's one that I've been doing ASP.NET presentations for a while, and it's one that I've gotten over the years for previous versions of ASP.NET, and I never had a good answer. And people would say like, hello, you're in Germany, you're speaking to me about ASP.NET, and my sites don't work in German, you know, like, and I'd say, yeah, sorry about that. Fortunately, with ASP.NET Core, we've got a good solution for that. They've actually thought through this, and I'm really pretty happy with the level of support for globalization and localization. Here in the docs, the globalization, localization in ASP.NET Core doc is, there's a lot of information here. Another thing that I love is just looking at the name of contributors. For instance, Nadim and Hisham, both folks that are not from the US and are experts in localization, and have contributed code and documentation to this. So it's exciting to see the global community contributing to our globalization, localization efforts.
Awesome.
First, a term as far as globalization and localization, definitions. So globalization is the process of making my application able to speak many languages.
Okay.
And then localization is the step of actually saying, great, now let's target it for a specific culture or language, right?
Okay.
So globalization is opening it up, and then localization is focusing it to a list of supported languages.
All right.
Right? So there's a lot of different things in here. There's information about how to make my content localizable. The main things that you're going to see is your code behind and your razor. Right? Those are your two kind of main places.
Okay.
So we'll take a quick look at this. This is, like I said, this is a long document, and there are some complexities to localizing your applications. And so I refer you to the docs to really dig into this. But for the time we have to look at this, I'm going to show you, first of all, here is a localization sample. This is prepared. This is actually in that doc. It goes through and it talks you through this exact demo here.
Okay.
So some things that are set up here, first of all, in my services, so I'm running the app right now, so I've got a smaller screen available, but in my services, we actually, as part of configuring services, built into that is the ability to say things like, here are my supported cultures, right? So I can go through and I can say, here are the supported cultures that my application has. So this is the, after I've globalized it, these are the languages I've localized for. Okay? So I can go through and set both supported cultures, and I can also go in and set a default request culture.
Okay.
So if the browser does not present a culture it doesn't say the local languages, then I can go through here and I can specify that. And I could even, for all these things, because they're in code, I can go through and run my own custom logic, maybe even hit a database.
Okay.
So that's that part there. Let's take a look at this app, actually. So this is an example application. You'll see down in the footer, it says language is English. And if I drop this down, now I'm in French, right? And so portions of this have been localized. This is using the resources. We'll take a look in a second. But this is showing kind of where this comes from. My French is not so good, so but we can look around throughout the site and we can see some things in here. So for instance, let's see if we've got our contact page, and yes, our contact page is localized, right? So we can actually take a look at how these resources are set up. One other thing, actually, before we jump into that, I want to point out just a small funny thing. I wanted to show this off, and here they've built in this little drop-down for English and French.
Right, that's built into the sample.
Into the sample.
That's not built into ASP.NET Core.
That's not a standard feature, no. And so I didn't realize that was there. Fortunately for you, I'm going to show you something that you can use. So this is an example. This is an extension where I can go in and change my language, my culture, as I'm sending it back to the browser. So I can actually, in here, if I set this to French, you can use this as you're testing your applications. This is a culture switcher, right? And so you can go through and do that in your apps as well.
So what that culture switcher does is it effectively changes the browser to send that header that says, accept the French language information. Exactly.
Yep. So now let's look at how those resources are configured. So these are actually the standard kind of default way that .NET does localization is using resource files. So if I go into one of these, there's these are actually resx files or XML, but there is an editor thing for this that I can use.
An editor plugin for Visual Studio.
It's built into the
Fantastic.
UI, right? Yep. So that's kind of the standard way to do this. It is an extensible system where I can kind of I can supply those other ways, but this is kind of the tooling is built in for this. And then when I look at how I light this up in a view, for instance, we use this localizer. What's neat about this localizer is it actually is, the key is my default culture. So what I can say here is if there's nothing specified or if it's my local culture, I'm going to use home page. Otherwise, I'm going to pull it in. I'm going to use that as the key to look up what it should be.
All right.
If that makes sense. If you've used localization in the past, it can be frustrating to try and dig through and understand, it's hard to read localized pages because the localized pages themselves can be, it's a bunch of keys. It's a bunch of, strange, hard-to-read things. So for instance, if we look at this now, here if we look at my contact page, you'll see that these localized strings say things like localizer phone, localized support. So these are it's actually pretty readable, right? And then if I want to look at, well, what is the localized string for instance, support on my contact page? Now I go into contact and I can see here's support and that's what it's pulling in from that one, right? So it's actually just showing that string there. But it's explaining that's where it came from.
Now, I'm seeing a hierarchy, and it looks like a naming convention for these resource files.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. So that's how they're being pulled in based on, exactly, here's the views, and it actually maps views home, and then down here we've got the same, this is views home, right?
So if I'm in my home view, my home index view page, and I'm referencing the localizer, and I've specified the home page item in the indexer there, it's going to reach into the views home index resource and look for that same home page item. Oh, there it is, about halfway down. Okay.
Yep. And so there we are. This is the index.fr, and then if I had others, if I had Japanese, index.ja.resx,
okay.
et cetera, right?
And you were making the point that it uses my default language as the indexer for these keys over here. That way, if I'm not an English speaker and I'm writing this, and perhaps I'm French and I'm writing it and I want to provide German translations and whatnot, I can use my native language as the keys to access these.
Exactly.
Fantastic.
Yep. And so then your view can be readable by, whatever your local language, whatever your language
dev
is.
team in that case.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's really handy. So that's kind of the main thing. There's also, of course, we're also seeing things like here is for the controller as well, right? So here I've got resources for my home controller. And let's take a look in my controllers up here. And we'll look in my home controller. And so we've passed in this iString localizer, right? And then we're able to, it's injected, and it's just view data, message. Here normally I would just set a string. Instead I use localizer and calling to that service I've injected, and then again, that key. So my controller, the code is still readable by me in my default language, in my local language, right? And then it's actually just going to localize this at runtime.
So once again, the localizer knows that it's operating inside of the home controller class.
Exactly.
So it's going to find the home controller resource to inject from.
Yep.
I got it. Okay.
Yeah. So that's really all there is to it. One other cool thing I want to show you is resx files are kind of a Microsoft localization thing. And it works great for some people. The tooling's all there and all that. I've talked to some people that do a good amount of localization, and PO files are kind of standard outside of the Microsoft dev world.
Okay.
PO files, the format is pretty simple, and it can also be easy to pass off to a localizer. They can do the work. They know their PO files. It's easy to work with, and then they can kind of pass it back to you.
So do I have to convert those PO files to resx?
No. So that's a cool thing. So Orchard, the Orchard project, Orchard Core. So if I look up here, let's go to orchardproject.net, I believe. So Orchard is a .NET powered CMS.
Okay. And
Orchard Core has support for PO file localization. So this is actually in the docs here. If we go to the docs.microsoft.com, looking in the localization section, they talk about PO files and recommend using Orchard Core for that. So here you're seeing, here's a sample PO file. It can be a lot simpler and lighter weight to use a PO file as opposed to a resx file, which has a lot of XML to it, right? So that's kind of the standard for it, for how it looks. And then here you'll see inside the application. So here we are doing services.add portable object localization. So that lights that up. Otherwise, we just configure those default and supported cultures, just like we did before, right? So that's that. And then the final thing I want to show you here is my PO file.
Okay.
So, to kind of circle way back, we talked about what globalization and localization are. In the process of internationalizing an application, globalizing is making your application ready to be localized. Localization is where you actually drill down and you say, I support the following 4 languages, and here's how I here's how I write those strings. We looked at how you can use the localizer both in views and in my code, in my controllers or code behind using that localizer service. And then finally, we looked at where I can get those strings from, and we can pull them either from a resx file, and that's supported in the Visual Studio tooling, and it's an XML file. If you prefer to use PO files, we looked at how Orchard Core supports that, and we showed a sample of using that.
That's terrific.
So I'll circle back finally to, if you want to dig deeper into this, I highly recommend the docs on this and the sample file. Again, these people are worldwide experts on localization and ASP.NET, and they've been doing it before ASP.NET Core was a thing. So these are the people you want to learn from. So
terrific.
Yeah. So that's it. That's our look at globalization and localization in ASP.NET Core. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you watch some more of our videos on ASP.NET Core.
Catch you later.